The emergency room at Harlow Veterans Medical Center in Salt Lake City had seen plenty of broken soldiers, but nothing like this. Colonel Marcus Vane was screaming in his sleep, thrashing, clawing at the IV in his arm, repeating a string of words no civilian should ever recognize, a classified radio call sign, buried for 12 years under layers of government redaction. And the nurse standing beside his bed, quiet, plain, wearing scuffed blue scrubs, leaned down and answered him, calmly, correctly, with the exact response code used only by a ghost unit the military had officially declared dead. The colonel stopped screaming and stared at her like she was a ghost. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because the story you're about to hear is only the beginning. Every week we bring you cinematic stories that will keep you up at night. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that hospital room and find out who this woman really is. The night shift at Harlow Veterans Medical Center ran on the kind of silence that wasn't actually quiet. Monitors beeped, wheels squeaked against linoleum. Somewhere down the hall, a man with a shattered leg muttered through his medication, half in English and half in something else, probably whatever language his nightmares spoke. It was past 2 in the morning, and the third-floor trauma ward was the kind of place where time moved sideways. You came in counting hours. You left counting something harder to name. Nora Ellison had been working this floor for 3 years, and she knew the rhythms of it the way a sailor knows weather. She knew which patients would spike a fever around midnight. She knew which ones would pretend to sleep when the doctor walked through and then ring the call button the second the footsteps faded. She knew the difference between a man in pain and a man in memory, and she had learned, slowly and without anyone teaching her, that the second kind was usually worse. She was 33 years old, brown hair perpetually pulled back in a clip that had seen better days, a small scar on the inside of her left forearm that she never explained when anyone asked, which was rare because most people didn't ask Nora much of anything. She moved through the ward with a kind of deliberate economy, nothing wasted, nothing showy. The attending physicians generally regarded her as competent and forgettable, the kind of nurse who showed up on time, did the work, and didn't make waves. That reputation suited her exactly. She was checking a medication log at the nurse's station when the ambulance call came through from the ER. Trauma intake, male, late 40s, combat-related injury, referred from Fort Dunmore after presenting with a ruptured shoulder wound that had been improperly treated in the field. The chart flagged him as high priority. Active military. Rank, colonel. Name, Marcus Vane. Nora glanced at the name once, then she finished writing in the log and went to prep the room. Colonel Marcus Vane arrived on a gurney at 2:17 a.m., looking like a man who'd been through something that didn't have a clean medical classification. The shoulder wound was obvious, a through-and-through from a shrapnel fragment that had been packed and repacked badly, the tissue around it already showing signs of infection. But it was his face that told the real story. Pale, tight around the jaw, eyes fixed somewhere above the ceiling tiles at a point that didn't exist in this building. The ER attending, Dr. Philip Garrett, came in fast and loud the way he always did, snapping gloves onto his hands and talking before he'd even read the chart properly. Okay, let's see what we're dealing with. Colonel, I'm Dr. Garrett. Can you tell me your pain level on a scale of... I know what a pain scale is, Vane said. His voice was flat and military clipped. 7. The infection started 2 days ago. Someone packed it wrong in the field. Right, yes, I can see that. Garrett leaned over the wound, frowning. Nora, I need... Already pulling the saline and betadine, Nora said, from the supply cabinet on the other side of the room. Garrett didn't acknowledge her. He kept talking to the colonel, asking the questions he was supposed to ask, establishing rapport the way the hospital's patient care training told him to. Vane answered in monosyllables. He wasn't being rude. He was conserving something. Energy, maybe. Or just the particular kind of patience that comes from understanding that most conversations are scaffolding around information you could just say directly. Nora worked around Garrett without getting in his way. which took a specific kind of spatial awareness that she had, and he didn't seem to notice. She prepared the wound irrigation while he was still talking, had the antibiotic hanging before he ordered it, and positioned the light over the injury site at the exact angle he would have asked for in another 20 seconds. He ordered everything. She had already done it. It wasn't magic, it was just attention. The wound was cleaned and dressed, the infection assessed, and the course of treatment mapped out in 35 minutes. Garrett signed off on the admission orders, told the colonel he'd be moved upstairs within the hour, and left without looking at Nora once. She stayed to finish the documentation. Vane watched her from the gurney. "You were ahead of him the whole time," he said. Nora looked up from the tablet. "He's a good doctor." "That's not what I said." She went back to the documentation. "How long has the shoulder been bothering you?" "Longer than 2 days, if that's what you're actually asking." She wrote something down. "The infection suggests you were moving around on it after it was packed." "That's not great." "It was a complicated situation." "Most of them are," she said, and she wasn't being dismissive, just stating something that both of them seemed to understand applied to more than his shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What's your name?" "Nora Ellison." "How long have you been a nurse?" 8 years. He studied her with the same calibrated look she'd seen in exactly 2 kinds of people in her life. The ones who had been trained to assess threats quickly, and the ones who had learned it the hard way. Colonel Marcus Vane looked like he'd done both. 8 years, he said, as if he was filing it somewhere. She closed out the chart. "Someone will be down to take you up to 3. Try not to pull the dressing." She told herself she didn't recognize the name. She'd looked at a lot of names over 3 years, hundreds of patients. It was possible, it was entirely possible, that the name Marcus Vane meant nothing to her beyond what was written in the chart. She told herself that on the elevator up to the 3rd floor, where her regular shift was waiting. She told herself that while she checked on a post-surgical patient in room 304 and updated fluid intake logs and answered 3 call buttons in a row, she was good at telling herself things. It was past 4 in the morning when she heard it. The sound started as a low, strangled noise from room 311, where they'd put the colonel. She was already moving before she'd consciously decided to, crossing the hallway in 7 quick steps, pushing the door open with one hand. Vane was sitting up in bed, or trying to. The IV had pulled taut. His right arm was raised, the fingers of his hand open and spread like he was reaching for something. A radio, maybe, or a rifle, or another person's arm in the dark. His eyes were open but not seeing the room. He was talking. Fast, low, cycling through words that sounded technical and specific and utterly dislocated from a hospital in Salt Lake City. "Sierra Kilo. Forward. I need Sierra Kilo at the... We're pinned at the ridge. The bird is not coming. They told us the bird was... Longbow. Respond. Longbow actual. Do you copy? This is Vane at checkpoint." Nora crossed the room in 4 steps. She didn't shout. She didn't grab him. She reached over and eased the IV line slack with one practiced motion, and then she said, quietly and without hesitation, "Longbow actual. This is Sierra Kilo. We have your position. Hold." The words were out of her mouth before she'd decided to say them. Vane stopped. Not gradually. Immediately. The way a system crashes when it receives an input, it wasn't designed to handle. His arm dropped. His eyes, still not entirely present, moved to her face. "Sierra," he said. "Hold position," she said, keeping her voice level. "Extraction is in progress." Something went through him that she recognized. Not relief. Closer to the thing that comes before relief. When you've been holding your breath for so long that the first inhale hurts. He came back slowly. She watched it happen. The room reasserted itself. The monitors, the ceiling tiles, the sound of the ward at night. And she watched him process each element until he was more or less present again. He looked at her. Really looked at her this time. Not the calibrated threat assessment look from the ER, but something raw and more specific. "What did you just say to me?" Nora was already reaching for his pulse, 2 fingers at his wrist, her eyes on her watch. "Your heart rate is elevated. That's normal after an episode like that. You should... What did you just say to me?" It wasn't a question anymore. She kept her eyes on her watch. I said hold position. It's a standard grounding phrase for Sierra Kilo was the call sign of a classified forward unit, he said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which she understood was more serious than loud. It was operational for 14 months beginning in 2009. It was never declassified. It doesn't exist in any public record or training manual. There is no protocol that would give a trauma nurse that call sign. Nora released his wrist. She wrote down a number on the pad she carried. She was aware of exactly how her breathing sounded, and she was controlling it. Your pulse is 94, she said. That's going to come down. Can you tell me what you last ate? Who are you? The question sat between them like something with weight. She put her pen in her pocket. She looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the specific quality of exhaustion that came from carrying something for a long time, the scar above his left ear that she had noticed in the ER and had not mentioned and would not mention. I'm the nurse on your floor tonight, she said, and right now I need to check your wound dressing and document this episode. If you're having recurring combat-related nightmares, there's a PTSD consultation resource. Don't do that. She stopped. Don't put the clipboard between us, he said. I just heard you respond to a classified call sign in a dead unit's protocol. I need you to tell me how you know that. She looked at him for a long moment. She was very good at not showing things on her face. She had spent years getting good at that. Get some sleep, Colonel, she said. Your dressing is fine. She was out of the room before he could say anything else. Dumbat. She didn't sleep that night, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the specific quality of the wakefulness, not the ordinary anxious kind, the kind that came from a long shift and a hard interaction, but something older and more particular, something she hadn't felt in 3 years. By 5:30, she was in the hospital's small break room with a coffee she wasn't drinking, staring at the wall. The fluorescent light above the door had a flicker that the maintenance team had been meaning to fix for 6 weeks. She counted the flickers. It was something to do. She'd made one mistake. In 11 years, across 2 continents, 3 different names, and one very specific set of decisions that she did not revisit during regular business hours, she had made exactly one mistake. And it had happened at 4 a.m. in a trauma ward in Salt Lake City because a colonel with a shrapnel wound and old nightmares had said 2 words in a sequence that her body remembered before her brain could intercept the response. She wasn't sentimental about it. The mistake had happened. The question was what came next. Colonel Marcus Vane was not, she was reasonably certain, a threat to her directly. She knew his record, not because she'd looked him up recently, but because she'd known it a long time ago. He was special operations, decorated, the kind of officer whose file had words like integrity in it that weren't just personnel language. He wasn't corrupt. She didn't think he was corrupt, but he was curious, which in some ways was worse. She went back to work at 6 when the day shift started bleeding into night shift and the ward got loud for 20 minutes and then quiet again. She had 4 patients to check, 2 medication schedules to review, and 1 family meeting to sit in on because the attending had asked her to be there, and she understood why. Families responded to her in a way they sometimes didn't respond to doctors, something about the way she talked to people without talking down to them. Room 311 was on her list. She did the other 3 first. He was awake when she came in. Sitting up, bed adjusted, the kind of posture that said he hadn't been back to sleep since she left. There was a military bearing to it that didn't disappear just because he was in a hospital gown. She checked the monitors without speaking. The infection markers were still up, but trending in the right direction. The shoulder dressing looked intact. I looked you up, he said. She kept her eyes on the monitor. What did you find? Nora Ellison, licensed practical nurse, 8 years, graduated from nursing school in Phoenix. No military service, no foreign travel on record, no gaps. That's all correct, she said. It's too correct, he said. Most people's records have texture. Yours reads like someone built it. She didn't say anything. She wrote a number on her pad. I have people I can call, he said. People with clearances. If I make that call, then you'd be using military resources on a hunch you developed during a sleep episode, she said mildly. That's documented, by the way. I filed the episode report this morning. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Sierra Kilo was my unit. She had known that. She had known that since the moment she'd seen his name on the intake chart and told herself clearly and firmly that it meant nothing. We lost people on the final operation, he said. We were told the rescue team never made it, that the bird went down, that everyone who came for us was KIA. He paused. But I carried someone to the extraction point that night. I still don't know how I got there. I was in and out. Blood loss. It was... He stopped. Someone carried me. Nora finished writing and closed the chart cover with a soft click. Your antibiotics are working, she said. The fever should break by tonight. I'll update your attending. Who were you? He said, and there was something in his voice that she hadn't heard there before. Not the soldier voice, not the colonel voice, but something tired and unguarded. Before the name that doesn't have any texture. Who were you? She looked at him. She had a system for this. She'd built it carefully, over years, with the specific architectural intelligence of someone who understood that structures only hold if every load-bearing piece is sound. She had rules, good rules, rules that had kept her quiet and safe and present in this hospital for 3 years. She looked at him and she said, "Get some rest, Colonel. I'll be back to check on you at noon." She left the room. She was halfway down the hallway when she heard his voice, not loud but carrying the way trained voices do. "I know you were there." She kept walking. She did not allow herself to think about what would happen if he made that call. The rest of the morning came and went the way mornings did. There was a new admission at 7:30. A 22-year-old infantry private named Dion Marsh, who'd come in through the ER with a blast concussion and a fractured wrist, and the particular blankness that Nora had learned to watch carefully. She spent 40 minutes with him, not all of it medical. Some of it was just sitting in the chair beside the bed while he stared at the ceiling, not talking, and she let him not talk, which was sometimes the most useful thing she could do. The attending on his case was Dr. Sasha Romero, who was sharp and efficient and not especially interested in what the nursing notes said because she'd developed the habit of assuming they were procedural rather than observational. That assumption was wrong, but Nora hadn't found a way to correct it that didn't cause friction, and friction drew attention, and she'd learned to pick that particular hill carefully. At 9:15, Dr. Garrett came through on rounds and stopped at the nurses' station where Nora was documenting. "Ellison, the colonel in 311. I need you off his case." She looked up. "Why?" "He's asking questions about the staff, specifically about you." Garrett's tone was the particular kind of professionally neutral that meant he'd been asked to do something he didn't entirely understand. "I don't know what happened last night, but I'd prefer to minimize complications." "He had a sleep episode," she said. "I filed the report." "Right, well, he's requesting a different nurse." She looked at Garrett and thought about several things she didn't say. "Okay," she said. "I'll put Morrison on him." "Morrison's good," she said, which was true and also beside the point, but there was nothing else to say, so she said it. Garrett left. She went back to the documentation. She made herself focus on the words in front of her. He was asking questions. She had expected that. She had told herself she'd expected that. But there was a difference between expecting something and feeling the specific texture of it when it arrived. The particular cold quality of knowing that someone was pulling on a thread and you were the thread. She finished the documentation. She went and checked on Dion Marsh, who was asleep now, his fractured wrist elevated on a pillow. She stood in his doorway for a moment. 22 years old. He had a tattoo on his forearm that she could read from the door, something in a font that was trying to look like military stencil but wasn't quite. She recognized the impulse to mark yourself in a language that looks like toughness. She understood that language. She went back to work. It was 11:40 when she found the note. Not a note exactly. A folded piece of paper, the kind from the notepad by the nurse's station, tucked under the edge of her keyboard where she would see it, but no one passing would notice it. She picked it up and opened it with one hand. 2 lines. Handwritten. The handwriting was controlled and precise. "I'm not going to report what I heard. I'm going to ask one more time, then I'll stop asking. Operation Harkin. Who came for us?" She stood at the station for exactly 10 seconds. Operation Harkin. The name went through her the way cold water goes through something that's been very carefully insulated for a very long time. She folded the paper. She put it in her pocket. She looked down the hallway toward room 311, and the door was closed, and she could see through the narrow window that a nurse, Morrison, probably, was inside adjusting something at the bedside. Nora turned in the other direction. She walked to the end of the hallway. She pushed through the door to the stairwell. She stood in the concrete quiet between the second and third floor landings where the cameras didn't reach, and she unfolded the paper again and read the 2 lines again. Operation Harkin. Nobody had said that name to her in 11 years. She put the paper back in her pocket. She pressed her back against the wall. Above her, the fluorescent tube in the stairwell was doing the same flicker as the one in the break room, and she counted them again. Because it was something to do while the part of her that knew exactly who she was decided what the part of her that had spent 3 years being Nora Ellison was going to do next. She had 7 hours left in her shift. She went back through the door and down the hallway. She knocked on the door of room 311. Morrison opened it, looked at her, and said, "Dr. Garrett said." "I know what Dr. Garrett said," Nora told her. "Give me 5 minutes." Morrison looked uncertain, the way people did when 2 pieces of authority were in conflict, and they weren't sure which one to follow. Nora didn't push. She just waited, which was usually more effective. Morrison stepped out. Nora stepped in. Colonel Marcus Vane was sitting exactly as she'd left him, upright, positioned, watching the door. When he saw her, something in his face that had been very tight loosened by a fraction. "You found the note," he said. "You should know," she said, closing the door behind her, "that I'm not going to confirm anything." "I know. And I'm going to deny this conversation happened if it becomes relevant." "I know that too." She crossed to the window. The morning light was coming in at a low angle. Outside she could see the hospital parking structure, and beyond it a slice of city. Ordinary buildings, ordinary traffic, ordinary February light on concrete. "You need to stop asking questions," she said. "I understand why you'd say that. I'm not saying it for my sake." He was quiet for a moment. Then for whose? She turned around. She looked at him across the room. The scar above his ear, the shoulder dressing, the particular quality of a man who has spent a long time being responsible for other people, and has it so deep in his muscle memory that he does it even in a hospital bed. "The people who made Harkin go away," she said, and her voice was very even and very controlled, "are not people who stop." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said, and then quieter. "I've always known that." She looked at him for 3 seconds longer than she should have. Then she turned and walked back to the door. She had her hand on the handle when he said her name. Not Nora, the other one. Spoken quietly, like a thing he'd been holding for a long time and was finally setting down. She didn't turn around. She didn't confirm it. She opened the door and walked out and let it close behind her. She was back at the nurse's station in 40 seconds. She picked up a chart. She started reading. Somewhere in the hospital, a phone was ringing, and somewhere in the parking structure below, she didn't know this yet, but she would, in about 4 hours, when the shift supervisor called a security alert and the cameras on the east entrance caught a still image that was blurry but deliberate, the kind of blurry that meant someone knew where the cameras were. A black SUV with no visible plates had been sitting in the same spot since 6:15 in the morning. The black SUV was still there at 3 in the afternoon. Nora knew because she'd checked. Not obviously. She hadn't walked to the window and stared down at the parking structure like someone who was worried about a black SUV. She'd checked the way she checked most things that concerned her, which was obliquely, in the gaps between other tasks, using the reflection in the glass of the supply cabinet near the east-facing window on the 3rd floor that gave her a diagonal sight line to the lower level of the structure if she stood at exactly the right angle while retrieving saline bags. Same spot. Same vehicle. The plates were obscured by what looked like a smear of road grime, but was almost certainly deliberate. She put the saline back and went to check on Dion Marsh. He was more awake now, sitting up with a tray of food he hadn't touched, the television on but muted. When she came in, he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her all day. Not suspiciously, just watching, the way young soldiers watch things, cataloging. "You gonna make me eat that?" he said. I'm going to document that it was delivered, she said. What you do with that information is your business. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. My sergeant used to say something like that. She checked his vitals. His blood pressure was still slightly elevated, which was consistent with the concussion and the pain, but the trajectory was fine. She wrote the numbers down. She asked him about his headache on a scale of 1 to 10. He said 4, which she suspected was 6, but wasn't going to argue. Is it always like this? He said. The hospital part. What do you mean? Just sitting here, waiting. Nobody telling you anything. She looked at him. He was 22 and he had a particular look in his eyes that she recognized, which was the look of someone who had been moving at a specific speed for long enough that stopping felt like a medical condition. Yeah, she said. It's always like that. She left him with the muted television and went back to the hallway. The shift supervisor, a compact, efficient woman named Bette Okafor, caught her at the nurse's station with the particular expression she used when she was delivering something she'd been asked to deliver and wasn't happy about it. Garrett wants your incident report on the Colonel's sleep episode flagged for review, Bet said. It's a standard report. I know it's a standard report. He wants it flagged anyway. Nora looked at her. Did he say why? Betty held the look for a beat. He said the Colonel's team made a call to the hospital administration this morning. Someone at the DOD level asking about staff, specifically asking about who was on shift last night. She paused. Is there something I should know about? No, Nora said. Bet studied her with the particular patience of someone who had worked hospital administration for 20 years and had learned that no in that tone usually meant not yet. She didn't push. She handed Nora the flagging form and walked away. Nora held the form. She looked at it for a moment. Then she filled it out and put it in the correct tray and went to get more coffee. The DOD call changed things. She'd expected Vane to ask questions. She hadn't expected him to move this fast, and she understood that what she'd taken for hesitation on his part, the note, the quiet conversations, the one chance he'd said he was giving her, wasn't hesitation at all. It was professional courtesy. He'd given her the opportunity to respond on her own terms before he started pulling the institutional levers he had access to. The fact that the call had already gone to hospital administration meant the lever pulling had begun. She had, at most, 48 hours before someone with a higher clearance than Colonel Vane started running her name through systems that had been built specifically to find the kind of inconsistencies that Nora Ellison's record didn't have, but Emily Carver's would. She didn't let herself use that name, even in her own head. It was a rule she'd made because rules mattered, and because the brain was a leaky system, and because the specific sharp ache that came with that name was not something she could afford to carry around during a hospital shift. She drank the coffee. It was bad coffee. The third-floor break-room coffee maker was 3 years past its useful life, and nobody wanted to spend the budget on replacing it. And she drank it anyway. She needed to think about what came next. The problem was that she'd spent 3 years deliberately not thinking about what came next. 3 years of being careful and small and unremarkable, of keeping her head down and her record clean and her past in a box where it didn't move around. She'd been good at it. She'd been very good at it. And then a colonel with a shrapnel wound had dreamed out loud in the wrong language, and she'd answered before she could stop herself, and now here she was, drinking bad coffee and calculating the half-life of an identity she'd built piece by piece. She could run. She'd done it before. She had a protocol for it, not written down anywhere, but carried in the kind of muscle memory that doesn't live in your muscles. A bag, a set of documents, a specific sequence of steps. She'd tested the protocol twice in 11 years, never fully executed it, and she was aware that it had a shelf life, and she didn't know if that shelf life had expired. She could also stay. That option had a different set of risks, and she sat with them while the bad coffee went cold. She was in the medication room at 4:15 when Dr. Garrett found her. He came in without knocking, which was his habit, and positioned himself in the doorway in the way that people do when they want to block an exit without appearing to block an exit. She noted the positioning and continued counting tablets. "We need to talk about the colonel," he said. "I'm not his nurse," she said. "You went into his room this morning after I specifically..." I went to check on a patient I was concerned about. Morrison can tell you it was 5 minutes. Garrett crossed his arms. He had a particular mode he operated in when he was trying to assert authority that he wasn't entirely sure he had, and it involved a specific set of postures: the crossed arms, the weight shift, the looking slightly to the side before making eye contact. She'd cataloged it in the first month she'd worked with him. The colonel's aide called the nursing director, he said. Not administration, directly to the nursing director. They want to know your credentials. My credentials are on file. They want more than what's on file. She counted the last 3 tablets and wrote the number down. Then they should request them through the appropriate channels. The nursing director has my HR file. She closed the medication tray. Is that everything? Nora. He said her name with the slightly strained patience of a man who had decided he was being reasonable and wanted recognition for it. I don't know what's going on. I don't need to know. But I need you to understand that if this becomes a problem for the department, it won't, she said. How can you be sure of that? She looked at him directly, which she didn't often do with Garrett because he found it unsettling, and she tried not to rattle the ecosystem unnecessarily. Because I'm good at my job and my record is clean, and whatever the colonel thinks he heard last night, he heard it during a classified stress episode that I documented and filed. There's nothing to find. Garrett held the look for a moment, then dropped it. He was a good doctor and an adequate manager and not a brave man, which in this specific situation was useful. Morrison stays on his case, he said. Fine. He left. She stood in the medication room for 30 seconds after the door closed, doing the specific arithmetic of what had just happened. The aide had called the nursing director. That was faster than she'd estimated. 48 hours was probably optimistic. She needed to make a decision by tonight. She made it through the rest of the shift without going near room 311. This required a specific kind of discipline that she was practiced at, but that still had a physical quality to it. A low-level tension across the back of her shoulders, a hyper-awareness of hallway sounds, the particular state of attention that wasn't quite alertness and wasn't quite anxiety, but lived in the space between them. She was good at functioning in that state. She'd spent years developing the capacity for it. She checked on Dion Marsh twice more. He'd eaten half the food, which was progress. His headache was down to a 3, which she thought was probably accurate this time. She made a note in his chart that the attending should consider a psych consult in the next 24 hours, not because he seemed acutely at risk, but because she could read the specific quality of the distance behind his eyes, and it was the kind that needed addressing while the window was open. She also made a note that nobody would read because it was a nursing note from Nora Ellison. And nursing notes from nurses like Nora Ellison were generally treated as procedural filler by the physicians on this floor. She made the note anyway. She'd learned to make the note anyway. At 6:45, 15 minutes before her shift ended, she went to the locker room, changed out of her scrubs, and sat on the bench in front of her locker for 4 minutes looking at her bag. Inside the bag, underneath the mundane infrastructure of her regular life, wallet, keys, the lip balm she'd bought at a gas station 3 months ago and kept forgetting to throw away, there was a phone. Not her regular phone. A second one, prepaid, fully charged, turned off. She'd checked the battery 3 weeks ago during what she told herself was routine maintenance and not the specific low-grade vigilance of someone who was always, at some level, waiting. She turned it on. It took 30 seconds to boot. She watched the screen with the particular flatness of someone who has learned not to hope for specific things. No messages. She sat with that for a moment. Then she put the phone in her jacket pocket, closed the locker, and left. The parking structure was the kind that was open on the sides, the kind where the wind comes through in February, and the lighting is the orange-yellow that makes everything look vaguely ill. She came down the ramp to the second level, where her car was, and she saw the black SUV immediately because it had moved. It was no longer on the lower level. It was on the second level, 3 rows over, positioned at an angle that gave it a clear sight line to both the elevator exit and the ramp. She kept walking at the same pace. She did not look at the SUV. She counted her steps to her car, 7 rows, 31 steps, and she was aware the entire time of the specific quality of stillness coming from the vehicle's direction, which was the stillness of people who are trained to be still and are doing it deliberately. She got in her car. She started it. She drove out of the structure at a normal speed, made a normal left turn, merged onto the normal street, and drove 4 blocks before she took a right turn she didn't usually take. She was being followed within 30 seconds. Not the SUV, a different vehicle. Silver, older, a sedan with the kind of forgettable profile that said rental. She would have missed it if she hadn't been looking for it, and she was always looking for it. She drove for 12 minutes through a completely ordinary route through an ordinary neighborhood, taking 3 turns that added no time to her commute, but happened to pass the kind of intersections where she could see what was behind her. The silver sedan stayed 3 cars back. It was patient, which meant professional. At a red light on Crestline, she put her hand in her jacket pocket and closed her fingers around the prepaid phone. She had 1 contact in it. 1 number, unlabeled, entered 11 years ago and never dialed. The light turned green. She drove home. She parked. She went inside her apartment, which was on the 4th floor of a building she'd chosen specifically for the stairwell access and the sight lines from the front windows. She did not turn on the main lights. She went to the kitchen, stood to the side of the window, and looked down at the street. The silver sedan was parked half a block down. She stood there for a moment. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do at 7 in the evening in February. Lights coming on, traffic thinning, the particular quality of cold that made the air look sharp at the edges. She watched the sedan. It didn't move. She took the prepaid phone out of her pocket. She looked at it. The single contact in it, unlabeled, just a string of digits, was a number she hadn't dialed in 11 years, and she had no way of knowing if it still worked, if the person on the other end was still the person she'd known, if calling it would help or accelerate whatever was already in motion. She dialed. It rang 4 times. She had decided by the 3rd ring that it was dead, that the number had been cycled out years ago, that she was going to have to make a different kind of decision tonight. Then someone picked up. Silence. Not dead silence. The kind with someone in it. Cascade, she said. The code word came out of her without effort, the same way the call sign had in Vane's room. 11 years, and the body didn't forget. More silence. Then a voice she hadn't heard in 11 years, still careful, still level. I was wondering when you were going to call. Her grip on the phone tightened by a fraction. She kept her voice even. They're here. I know, the voice said. They picked up your location 6 hours ago. I've been watching the flag. How, The colonel, the voice said simply. When he accessed the database. She closed her eyes, opened them. He's not involved. He triggered a tripwire that hasn't been touched in a decade. Involved or not, it doesn't matter. A pause. You need to listen carefully. There is a secondary file under Operation Harken, not the official record, a separate archive, that contains the authorizing signatures for what they did to that unit. We put it there in 2012. We didn't know if we'd ever be able to use it. The question was always whether the right witness would still be alive when the moment came. She stood very still in the dark kitchen. Where? She said. That's the problem. Another pause, and she could hear in it the specific weight of someone saying something they've been calculating for a long time. It's in the hospital system, in the medical records archive at Harlow. We routed it through a secure tag in the Veterans Administrative Database when we were building your cover. It's been sitting there for 3 years. You put it in my hospital. We didn't know it was going to be your hospital. The routing was automated. She looked at the silver sedan below, still not moving. If they find it before I do, she started. It's gone, the voice said. Yes, and so is everyone who can testify. She thought about the black SUV in the parking structure. The call to the nursing director. The speed of it. Not bureaucratic speed, but operational speed. The kind that said someone had been waiting for a trigger and had moved the moment they got one. How long do I have? She said. If I had to guess? The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment. They won't move tonight. Too visible. They'll want to do this clean. She said nothing. I'm sorry, the voice said, and she believed it, which didn't change anything. I know this isn't what you built. No, she said, it isn't. She ended the call. She stood in the dark kitchen for another 30 seconds. Then she put the phone back in her pocket and went to the closet in the bedroom, where behind 2 jackets and a pair of boots she hadn't worn in a year, there was a flat case, black nylon, The kind that looked like a laptop case but wasn't. She pulled it out. She set it on the bed. She opened it. Everything inside was where it should be. She'd checked 3 weeks ago, which was the same day she'd checked the phone battery, and she let herself understand, now that she'd run out of room for self-deception, that she hadn't been maintaining these things the way someone maintains emergency equipment. She'd been maintaining them the way someone maintains things they believe they will need. She closed the case. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about Dion Marsh and the psych consult note nobody would read. She thought about the colonel's handwriting on that notepad paper, controlled and precise. And the way he'd said the other name, the real one, quiet, like a thing being set down. She thought about 11 years of being careful and small, of building a life with the specific, meticulous patience of someone who understood that identities were structures, and structures required maintenance, and the load-bearing pieces had to hold. She thought about the file, sitting in a hospital database. 3 years, undisturbed, while she walked those hallways and changed dressings and wrote notes that nobody read. 3 years of being 30 feet from the thing that could either save everything or end it. She picked up her regular phone. She typed a text message to Betty Okafor that said she'd be coming in early tomorrow, something she did occasionally, nothing unusual about it. She hit send. She put the phone down. She did not sleep. She was back at Harlow Veterans Medical Center at 5:40 in the morning, 90 minutes before her shift started, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a bag that was heavier than her usual bag, and did not contain anything from the nylon case because she needed her hands free and her profile clean. The overnight security desk was staffed by a man named Gene, who was 61 years old and had worked the desk for 14 years, and who knew Nora Ellison well enough to nod at her without asking questions when she came in early and said she needed to catch up on documentation before the morning rush. This was not unusual behavior for Nora Ellison. She was the kind of nurse who came in early and caught up on documentation. She swiped her badge, she went to the elevator, she went to the 3rd floor. It was quiet at this hour, the particular expectant quiet of a hospital between shifts, when the overnight staff was tired and the day staff hadn't arrived and the ward operated on a kind of autopilot. She moved through it without drawing attention, which was not difficult because she had spent 3 years being the kind of person who didn't draw attention. She went to the nurse's station. She sat down at a terminal. She logged in. The hospital's record system was segmented: patient files, administrative records, the veterans database integration that had been added 4 years ago when Harlow was designated a regional VA partner facility. She knew the system. She used it every day. She knew its structure and its navigation, and more usefully, she knew its blind spots, the corners of the administrative database that were technically accessible under her login level, but that nobody ever went to because there was no clinical reason to, which meant nobody had thought to put an audit flag on them. She went to the Veterans Administrative Database. She went to the Records Integration Index. She went 3 layers deeper than anyone had a clinical reason to go. She was looking for a tag. A file attached to an administrative record under a specific format she'd been told about 11 years ago during a 20-minute conversation in a parking garage in Tucson, when she was a different person with a different name who had just made a decision that closed every door she'd been standing in front of and opened one she hadn't known was there. She found it on the 4th search string. A file tagged to a veteran's administrative record. The veteran's name a string of bureaucratic code that corresponded to no actual patient in the system. The attachment was labeled as a benefits documentation addendum. It was 18 megabytes. It had not been accessed since it was created. She put a drive in the terminal's port. She started the transfer. The transfer bar moved slowly. She watched the hallway through the station's glass partition. The ward was quiet. Down the hall, the door to room 311 was closed. She could see the line of light under it that meant the room light was on, which meant Vane was awake again, which was consistent with what she knew about him. 70%. 80. Footsteps in the hallway. She closed the auxiliary window on her screen and pulled up a patient chart, any patient chart, and started typing notes into it with the specific, unhurried body language of a nurse doing early morning documentation. The footsteps were Magda from overnight, doing a final round. Magda glanced at Nora as she passed, nodded, kept walking. 90%. The transfer completed. She removed the drive. She closed the auxiliary window. She logged out of the administrative database and back into the standard clinical system. She put the drive in her jacket pocket. She sat there for a moment, both hands flat on the desk, the way she sat when she was doing an internal inventory that she didn't want showing on her face. Then her eyes moved to the monitor on the desk beside the terminal. The security feed. 8 small squares, 8 camera views, cycling through the hospital's access points every 30 seconds. The east entrance came up. She watched the cycle come around to it. The black SUV was in the pickup zone, not the parking structure. The pickup zone directly outside the east entrance, where ambulances came in, where the angle was bad for the exterior cameras, where a vehicle could idle for 3 minutes before the security rotation would flag it as a concern. It had been there long enough that the overnight log would show it arriving at 5:22, 18 minutes ago. She took her hand off the desk. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She thought about the drive in her pocket and the file on it and the 11 years it had taken to arrive at this specific moment in a hospital hallway at 5:40 in the morning. She thought about running. She calculated it. The stairwell, the north exit, the street, the 3 blocks to a bus stop that ran early. She knew the timing. She'd mapped it, not because she was planning to run, but because she always mapped exits, the same way she always charged the phone and checked the case, the same way she always sat with her back to the wall in the break room. She looked down the hallway toward room 311. The line of light was still under the door. She picked up her bag and walked toward it. She knocked twice and opened the door before he could answer. Vane was sitting up, fully awake, with the kind of alertness that said he hadn't been asleep at all. He looked at her. His eyes went to the bag, then back to her face. "They're here," she said. "Not upstairs yet. Maybe 10 minutes. He straightened. The shoulder didn't let him do it cleanly. She could see the catch, the involuntary adjustment, but he did it. "How many?" he said. "2 vehicles that I've confirmed, probably 4 to 6 individuals." She came further into the room and lowered her voice, not from uncertainty, but from the specific professional habit of never talking louder than necessary. "I have something that can end this, but I can't get it out of the building alone." He looked at her for a long moment, not the calibrated look, not the assessment look, something cleaner than both of those. "Tell me what you need," he said. She opened her mouth to answer, and the hospital's overhead lights went out. The emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds after the main power dropped. Battery-backed fluorescence that threw everything into a flat, colorless yellow that made the room look like a photograph of itself. 3 seconds was enough time for Nora to cross to the door, ease it open 2 inches, and read the hallway. Empty. The ward overnight staff would be at their stations, responding to the power alert through established protocol, checking patient equipment, confirming the backup generator was cycling, calling facilities. That protocol would occupy them for the next 4 to 6 minutes. It was the kind of institutional response that was designed for mechanical failure, not for people who had cut the power on purpose. She closed the door. "We need to move now," she said. "Can you walk?" Vane was already pulling the IV line from his arm. He did it with the specific, joyless efficiency of a man who had pulled IV lines before, under worse circumstances. He pressed 2 fingers over the puncture point and held them there without being told. "Where are we going?" he said. "Server room on sublevel 2. Hospital records infrastructure." She was already at the bedside cabinet, pulling his clothes from it. He'd had a go bag from the transport, civilian clothes. They'd bagged and tagged them on admission. "The file needs to be transmitted externally before they reach the system. I have it on a drive, but the upload speed from the drive alone isn't enough. I need a hardwired port." "You said 10 minutes. That was an estimate based on them still being in the vehicle. If they've moved—" She didn't finish that sentence. She handed him his shirt. He put it on with one arm, the bad shoulder taking the sleeve carefully. She watched without comment. He didn't need her to comment. "I need to tell you something," she said, while he worked the buttons. "Before we're in a situation where there isn't time." He looked up. "The file contains authorization signatures from a deputy director level. Names, dates, the operational sign-off on what happened to your unit. It's not circumstantial. It's direct." She paused. "If we get it out, it goes to an investigative contact who has been sitting on corroborating intelligence for 3 years waiting for the primary source document. If we don't get it out, it disappears, he said. Everything disappears, including everyone who knows it exists. He held her look for a moment. Something in his face settled into a specific quality she recognized, the look of someone who had just confirmed something they'd suspected for a long time and was deciding how to carry it. Lead, he said. She opened the door. The hallway was still empty, but not silent. She could hear the overnight staff on the far end of the ward, Magda's voice and someone else's, the specific overlapping urgency of a team managing an unexpected systems event. The patient rooms were quiet. The monitors were running on backup power, casting their small green and amber lights through half-open doors. She moved fast, Vane half a step behind her, his breathing controlled and even in the way that said the shoulder was hurting, and he was managing it and not discussing it. The stairwell door at the south end of the ward was their target, 16 paces. She counted them automatically, the same way she counted everything. They were at 12 when the radio crackled. Not a hospital radio. The specific compressed digital sound of tactical comms coming from the east stairwell on the other end of the hallway. She grabbed Vane's arm and pulled him left, through the door of the supply room, and eased it closed behind them with one hand while keeping her eyes on the gap at the bottom until the light from the hallway was stable and unbroken. In the dark, she could hear him breathing. She could hear her own pulse, which was elevated but not out of range. The supply room smelled like antiseptic and cardboard. "They're in the building," she said, barely above a whisper. "I heard. South stairwell is still clean. We have maybe 90 seconds. Then stop briefing me and go." She went. The south stairwell was clear. She took the stairs at a controlled run, not sprinting, because sprinting made noise and created a specific kind of auditory signature in a concrete stairwell, and Vane kept pace behind her with the grim competence of someone who had done much worse on much less recovery time. The sublevel 2 landing was cold, the way basement levels in old buildings were always cold, a damp institutional cold that the heating system never fully addressed. She pushed through the door. The sublevel corridor was narrow and lit by safety lighting only, which gave them 3 feet of visibility in either direction and a lot of deep shadow. The server room was 40 meters east, behind a standard-issue security door with a keypad and a badge reader. Her badge gave her access because the records room was technically part of the nursing documentation infrastructure, and whoever had designed the access system for this building had not thought through the security implications of that classification. She swiped her badge. The keypad accepted her PIN. The door clicked open. The server room was the size of a large closet, which was what it had been before the hospital's IT upgrade 6 years ago. Racks of equipment down both sides, a single workstation at the far end, the constant noise of cooling fans that made all other sounds slightly harder to parse. She went straight to the workstation, inserted the drive, and pulled up the transmission interface. Vane positioned himself at the door. She noted that he'd taken the doorside position without being asked, which told her things about his training that she already knew but found reassuring anyway. "How long?" he said. She looked at the file size and the connection speed. 7 minutes for full transmission, maybe 6 if the line is clean. It won't be 6. She knew that. She started the transmission anyway and pulled a second window, running a diagnostic on the connection quality. The hospital's hardwired infrastructure ran independent of the main power grid. It had its own circuit, which was why the servers hadn't dropped when the building power cut. That was the point. That was why she needed to be here and not trying to transmit via phone from a street corner. Transmission progress, 4%. "Tell me about Operation Harkin," Vane said from the door. "Now is not—" "We have 6 minutes. Tell me." She kept her eyes on the screen. "Your unit was sent to a forward position based on intelligence that was deliberately falsified. The asset you were protecting wasn't a friendly contact. He was a liability, someone who had documentation of an illegal weapons transfer facilitated by 2 defense contractors and a deputy director named Aldous Price." She paused. "When the transfer was exposed, Price needed the asset eliminated and any military witnesses removed from the equation. He arranged for your extraction to be canceled and the rescue team's orders to be rerouted. They told us no one came. The rescue team came. They were rerouted twice. By the time—" She stopped. "By the time they reached the position, it was almost over." The fan noise filled the space between them. "You were on the rescue team," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. "I was the medic. We came in on foot because the bird had been flagged as a navigation risk. That was the reroute, a false safety flag. We came in on foot, 3 of us, and we reached the position and—" She stopped again. "Transmission, 11%. 2 of us didn't come out. I got out with 4 of your people, including you." He was quiet for a long moment. "I remember hands," he said, "in the dark, pulling me. You were in hemorrhagic shock. You wouldn't have remembered much. I remembered enough to know someone came." His voice was very even. "For 11 years I remembered enough to know someone came, and the official record said no one did. She didn't say anything to that because there was nothing useful to say to it. Transmission, 19%. Dumb. She heard them at 23%. Not voices. Footsteps. In the corridor outside, the specific rhythm of people moving with tactical intent, controlled pace, intervals between steps that said at least 2 people moving in a formation. She'd heard that rhythm before in contexts where ignoring it was fatal. She looked at Vane. He'd heard it too. "How many entry points?" he said quietly. "1. The door you're standing at." He assessed the room in a single sweep. Rack equipment on both sides, no room to maneuver, the workstation cornered at the far end. It was a terrible tactical position, and they both knew it. "The keypad will log my badge swipe," she said. "They'll know we're in here. Then they'll stack outside and wait. Or they'll cut the backup circuit and take the transmission with it." That sat between them for 2 seconds. "Can you transfer faster?" he said. "Not without degrading the encryption. If the file arrives corrupted, it's no good. I know." He turned back to the door. "Is there anything in here that helps us?" She looked at the server room. She looked at it the way she'd learned to look at rooms a long time ago. Not for what they were, but for what they could be made into. "The cooling system," she said. "There's a return duct above the far rack. It connects to the building's HVAC, runs to the mechanical room on sub-level 1. It's not large." "How not large?" "Tight, single file. Which means one of us stays." "Transmission, 31%. "You take the drive if the transmission doesn't complete," she said. "The contact number is burned into the drive's secondary partition under a file marked maintenance log. The full transmission needs to reach them before anyone can contest its authenticity, but even partial—" "You're not staying behind," he said. "Colonel, that's not happening." He said it with the specific, uncomplicated flatness of a man stating a fact he'd already decided wasn't negotiable. "Tell me something else." She looked at the duct. She looked at the door. She looked at the transmission counter. 34%. And she thought about something she hadn't thought about in 3 years. A specific piece of information about this building that she'd filed away during her first month at Harlow, when she'd spent a Sunday afternoon walking every corridor and stairwell and basement level of the hospital, because that was the kind of thing she did. And she did it so habitlessly and quietly that she'd never had to explain it to anyone. "The backup power circuit," she said. "The server room runs on the backup, but the backup circuit has a manual isolation switch in the mechanical room upstairs. If someone trips it, everything in this room goes dark. But the transmission is already in progress. The hospital's network router has a 10-minute cache. If the circuit trips, the transmission pauses. It doesn't break. When power comes back, it resumes from the last packet." He turned to look at her. "If they cut the circuit," she said, "they cut themselves off from the system too. They can't delete what's already uploading. They can only stop it from completing." She paused. "But if someone trips the isolation switch back on before the cache clears, the transmission finishes," he said. "Yes. The switch is in the mechanical room. Sub-level 1, north end. Which means someone has to get there while we're pinned in here." She was already looking at the duct, 40%. "I'm smaller," she said. He looked at her. He didn't look happy about it, which was a human response, and she respected it even as it was irrelevant. "If they breach this door," she said, "you can slow them down for 4 minutes, maybe 5. The equipment racks, second one on the left. It's not bolted to the floor on the east side. It goes over. That buys you another 90 seconds. She was moving to the rack as she talked, reaching up for the duct access panel. "Don't try to fight all of them. Disrupt and delay. The transmission needs to hit 60% before the cache can hold it. What happens at 60%? The header packet and the authorization signatures are fully uploaded. That's the primary evidence. Everything after that is corroborating documentation. She got the panel off. The duct was dark and narrow and smelled like 10 years of recirculated air. If it gets to 60 and then cuts, the contact can work with what's there. He crossed the room to her. He put one hand on the panel frame and looked at her with the specific directness of someone who didn't have time for anything other than direct. "How confident are you in this?" he said. 60% confident, she said. And then, because he deserved the honest answer, which is the best odds we have, he held her look for 1 second. Then he stepped aside. She went into the duct. It was exactly as bad as she'd known it would be. The specific claustrophobic arithmetic of a space that was sized for airflow and not for a human body moving through it in a hurry. She pulled herself forward on her forearms, her knees finding no good purchase on the metal, the sound of her own movement echoing back at her in a way that made it impossible to hear anything outside. 15 meters to the first junction, left toward the riser, up the riser to sublevel 1. She had done more uncomfortable things than this. She allowed herself to recall, briefly and without sentiment, approximately 3 of them, and then she put her head down and moved. Behind her, through the duct walls, she heard the door. They'd breached it. The sound was controlled, not explosive, which said they had tools, which said professional, which she'd already assumed. She heard the specific noise of equipment being moved and the specific human sounds of men in a confined space making tactical decisions. She heard Vane's voice once, saying something she couldn't parse, and then a different sound that was a rack going over. The east rack, second on the left, the one she'd told him about. She moved faster. The riser was vertical, a 20-degree incline that the building drawings probably called a riser, but was functionally a steep climb through a metal shaft that was 32 centimeters wide. She went up it with her hands and knees, and one sharp moment when her jacket caught on a seam and she had to stop and work it free with 3 seconds of focused patience she did not have. Sublevel 1. The junction opened into a larger horizontal section that she could almost crouch through if she kept her head angled. North end. 30 more meters. She was counting her pulls when the backup power went out. Not the main power that was already cut. The backup circuit. The server room went dark below her. She couldn't see it, but she felt it somehow, the way you feel a sound stopping rather than hear it, which meant someone in the server room had found the circuit information and called it up to someone else, or someone else already knew. Either way, the transmission had just paused. She had 10 minutes before the cache cleared. She moved faster, which was not a smooth process in a 32-centimeter duct, but was the only available option. The mechanical room access panel was where the building diagram she'd memorized said it would be. A hinged plate at the north terminus of the horizontal section, secured with 2 screws that were finger-tight, because whoever serviced this section last had not bothered to resecure it properly. She got it open in 20 seconds and dropped into the mechanical room feet first, landing on concrete, her knees taking the impact with a protest she noted and set aside. The mechanical room was larger than the server room. Full-height ceilings, the noise of the building's heating infrastructure, pipes and conduit running in every direction. The isolation switch for the backup circuit was on the east wall, a red-handled manual breaker in a gray metal box that was labeled in the specific optimistic font of hospital maintenance signage. She crossed to it. She had her hand on the switch when she heard someone behind her. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, the mechanical room's main entrance, the one that connected to the sublevel 1 corridor. Not one of the people from the server room below. He'd come a different route, which said they'd split, which said they'd anticipated the duct access, which said someone had looked at the building schematics before they came in. He was somewhere in his 30s, wearing civilian clothes that were too deliberate, too neutral. The kind of clothes that said plain clothes the same way a uniform said uniform. His right hand was at his side. He looked at her standing at the breaker box with her hand on the switch, and he said, "Step away from that." She looked at him. She looked at his hand. She looked at the distance between them, which was 8 meters, and the distance between her and the switch, which was 0, and the distance between 0 and what happened if she didn't throw it. "You have a problem," she said. "You're the one with the problem." "No," she said, and her voice was very even, the same voice she used when she was talking someone through something difficult in a trauma bay. You have a principal who sent you into a federal medical facility to retrieve a document that is currently in the process of being transmitted to a federal investigative body. Whatever you were told this operation was, that's what it is. And I'm telling you that so you have the information before you make your next decision. He was quiet for a second. People were usually quiet for a second when she talked like that, which was long enough. The transmission is paused, he said. Step away from the switch. The transmission is cached, she said. There's a difference. One of us knows what that means for the legal exposure on this operation. Step. She threw the switch. He moved at the same moment, crossing the room faster than she'd given him credit for, and she was already moving sideways because the switch was thrown and the circuit was live again, and the remaining question was the next 30 seconds, which was not going to be simple. He was good. She'd assessed that from his positioning and confirmed it from his movement. Economy, no wasted motion, the kind of trained approach that said he'd been doing this for a while. He got his hand on her left arm, and she let him get it, because the alternative was fighting for the arm, and she didn't want the arm, she wanted his balance. And getting a hand on someone's arm when they don't resist is a specific mechanical mistake that she'd learned to wait for. She got his elbow. She used the wall. It wasn't clean. Her shoulder hit the pipe conduit on the way, and the impact sent a spike up through her neck that she filed under things to address later. He went down with more noise than she'd intended. One knee, catching himself, which meant he wasn't out, which meant she had approximately 2 seconds. She didn't wait for the 2 seconds to run out. She went back through the duct access, hands first, pulling, her knees finding the metal again, moving back the way she'd come in the specific graceless hurry of someone who had done the hard part and needed to survive long enough for it to matter. Below her, in the server room, she could hear the change. The equipment cycling back up, the fans resuming, the particular electrical personality of a room restoring itself. The transmission had resumed. She counted seconds while she moved. By the time she reached the riser, the count was at 40, which meant the transmission had been off the cache for 40 seconds, which meant it needed another, she did the math on the move, 4 minutes and change to reach 60% if the progress had been at 38 when the circuit tripped. She went down the riser faster than she'd gone up, the incline working with gravity now in a way that was efficient and not entirely controlled. She came back through the duct panel into the server room. The room was a wreck. One rack was fully over, equipment scattered. A second rack was at an angle, one of its mounting bolts pulled from the floor. The cooling fans were cycling back up with a strained, high-pitched sound that said something in the rack had been damaged. Vane was on the floor on the far side of the overturned rack. She crossed to him in 3 steps. He was conscious. She confirmed that first, his eyes tracking her when she came into his eye line. His lip was cut, and there was a contusion developing above his right eye. More relevantly, his shoulder dressing had been compromised. She could see the dark spread of blood through the fabric. "How many?" she said. 3 in here, he said. "They're not... I don't think they're..." He stopped, recalibrated. "They're contained, for now." She looked around the room. 2 men were down, not unconscious, but not moving with any particular urgency. One with the specific stillness of someone managing pain, one watching her from the floor with an expression that said he was calculating his options. The third she didn't see, which meant he'd retreated to the corridor. She went to the workstation. The transmission counter read 51% and climbing. She pulled her phone, her regular phone, and opened the contact that was listed as hospital IT support, and wasn't. She sent a single text. "Package in transit, compromised location, need external pull." She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the transmission counter, 54%. Vane had gotten himself upright against the wall. "What did you send?" "A request for the contact to initiate a pull from their end. It speeds the transmission. Instead of the hospital pushing the file, their server pulls it, faster, and it makes the interruption harder." "Will they get it in time?" 57%. She heard footsteps in the corridor, more than one person, coming from both directions this time, which meant the man from the mechanical room had called it in, and they'd reorganized outside, which was what she would have done. which meant the next 60 seconds was going to be the operational decision point for everyone involved. 59. "Get ready to move," she said. "Where?" 60. She looked at the transmission counter. 60%. The header packet, the authorization signatures, the core of the evidentiary record of what Aldous Price had ordered and signed and buried. 60% of it was sitting on a server she didn't control, in the hands of a contact who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this. The door came open. 4 of them this time, and they were done being subtle about it, which told her the operation had shifted from retrieval to something with a different objective. And she understood with the specific, unambiguous clarity of a person who has been in bad situations before that the thing she had spent 11 years trying to prevent had just become the thing she needed to survive the next 10 minutes. She looked at Vane. He was on his feet, which was more than she'd expected, his right arm held slightly out from his body in the way that said the shoulder was past its tolerance, but he was choosing to ignore that information. He looked at her. She looked at the 4 men in the doorway. She looked at the transmission counter. 61%. And then the screen went dark as the workstation lost power. And this time it wasn't the circuit. It was a clean physical cut from outside the room. And she understood simultaneously that the transmission was done for now, and that someone had been watching the counter from the outside and had timed the cut to stop it at 61. 61%. The authorization signatures were out. The primary evidence was out. What remained on the drive and what remained in the cache was corroboration. Important, but not the thing that Aldous Price was most afraid of. She looked at the 4 men. She thought about the drive in her pocket, and then she thought about what she hadn't told Vane yet, what she hadn't told anyone, what she'd carried since the night of Operation Harkin when she'd walked out of enemy territory with 4 surviving soldiers and a piece of information that she'd never been able to use without the authorization signatures to prove it, and that she had never, not in 11 years, written down anywhere, because some things were safer as memory than as evidence. One of the 4 men stepped forward. He was older than the others, and he carried himself with the specific authority of someone who had been given a name to bring in rather than an objective to complete. "Emily Carver," he said. The name landed in the room the way names do when they've been kept quiet for a very long time. Beside her, she felt Vane go still. "We're not here to hurt you," the man said, in a tone that said the opposite of that. "We just need the drive." She looked at him. She thought about the 61% sitting on a server somewhere. She thought about the 4 surviving soldiers from Operation Harkin, 3 of whom had rebuilt their lives under the assumption that the people who betrayed them had gotten away with it. She thought about Dion Marsh upstairs, asleep with his fractured wrist on a pillow, and the psych consult note nobody would read. She thought about the deputy director's name, Aldous Price, and the second piece of information she'd been carrying, the one she'd never written down. "The drive," the man said, "and we walk away." She looked at him. "The drive is already copied," she said. 3 redundancies. You can have the one in my pocket." She watched his face for the micro-expression that told her whether he knew that was true or not. He didn't know, which meant they didn't know everything. And that meant there was still 1 card left that nobody in this room, not even Marcus Vane, standing 3 feet to her left with a bleeding shoulder and the expression of a man who had just had his name spoken in a basement and was recalibrating every assumption he'd made for the past 11 years, had any idea she was holding. The man's name was Harlan Tuck, and she knew that not because he'd introduced himself, but because she'd seen his face before, not in person, in a photograph, a grainy surveillance still in a file she'd been given 11 years ago, during the 48 hours after Operation Harkin, when her contact was trying to map who had ordered the betrayal and who had carried it out. Tuck had been mid-level then, a contractor operative, 1 layer below the decision-making, the kind of man who received orders through buffers and executed them without asking which direction the paperwork moved. He'd moved up, apparently. She held his gaze and kept the specific quality of stillness in her body that said she was not deciding whether to comply. She had already decided, and what he was reading as hesitation was actually her giving him the opportunity to make a different choice before the one she'd made became his problem. He didn't take it. "The drive," he said again. She reached into her jacket pocket. She felt the drive. She also felt the prepaid phone, which was still there, and the decision she'd made before she climbed into the duct, which was that if this moment arrived, she would do the thing she'd spent 11 years not doing, because 11 years ago she hadn't had the authorization signatures, and now she did, or 61% of them, which was enough. She held the drive out. He crossed the room and took it, and she let him take it, and she watched him look at it with the expression of a man who had just completed his objective and was performing a rapid internal calculation about what came next. "There's a secondary," she said, before he could complete the calculation. "You know that because you were listening to what I said, and you're not sure if I was telling the truth." He looked at her. "You're right not to be sure," she said. "Here's what's actually true. The authorization signatures are already transmitted, 61%, the core of the record. Deputy Director Aldous Price, his operational authorization for the deliberate abandonment of a U.S. Special Operations Unit, the weapons transfer documentation that your employers were protecting, and the sign-off on the rescue team's orders being rerouted." She paused. "That's out. That's already out. What's on that drive is corroborating documentation that improves the case but doesn't change its foundation." Tuck's face had gone through several things while she was talking. She watched them go through it, which was useful. "But there's something that isn't in the transmission," she said. "Something that isn't on any drive. Something I've been carrying since the night of Harkin, because I was there and I heard it with my own ears, and I never wrote it down, because I understood that writing it down made it findable, and keeping it in my head made it mine." She let that sit for 1 second. "I'm the only living person who can place Price at the operational communications relay on the night of the extraction. I heard his voice personally authorizing the reroute, in real time. I was on the line. The room was very quiet except for the fan cycling back up." "That's testimony," she said, "which is different from documents. Documents can be contested, classified, buried in legal procedure for years. A direct witness to a criminal order is something else." Tuck looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running the math and not liking the result, which was the point. "You're telling me this because you want something," he said. "I'm telling you this because you're standing in a federal medical facility with 4 men who just assaulted a decorated military officer, and in approximately," she glanced at her watch, "6 minutes, the hospital's security team is going to reach this sublevel because the power cut triggered an automatic distress protocol to Salt Lake City PD and the VA's facility security office, and at that point the window for everyone in this room to make smart decisions closes." She looked at him with the same directness she used for the hardest conversations in the trauma ward, the ones where she had to tell someone the truth they'd been hoping not to hear. "Walk away," she said. "Take the drive. Tell Price you contained it. You have maybe 36 hours before the transmission is processed, and the authorization request clears through the investigative chain, and how you use those 36 hours is your business." Tuck looked at her for 4 long seconds. He looked at Vane. He looked at the 2 men still on the floor. He made a hand signal she recognized from a different life. The 2 mobile men moved toward the door. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He left. She counted to 3 after the footsteps faded. Then she let out a slow breath that she'd been managing carefully for the last 4 minutes and turned to Vane. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the assessment look, not the soldier look, not even the specific exhausted look of a man carrying a long wrong that had just gotten heavier and lighter at the same time. It was something less defended than any of those. "You let them take the drive," he said. "The drive was a copy. I copied the file the night before I brought it in, a full backup on a cloud partition that my contact has access credentials to." She looked at his shoulder. The blood had spread further through the dressing. "We need to get that looked at." "You told him it was already transmitted." "Most of it is." "And the rest?" "The cloud copy." "Is something I needed Tuck to not know about until he was out of the building." She moved to him, pulling a fresh dressing from the supplies she'd pocketed on the way down. Old habits, she always pocketed supplies when the situation suggested she might need them, and began assessing the shoulder without asking permission. "He'll find out. When he reports to Price and Price's people start running the transmission intercept data, they'll see the 61% that went through, and they'll start pulling every thread to figure out what else exists. But by then, By then, the authorization request has moved up the investigative chain, he said. By then, it's not my problem anymore, she said. Hold still. He held still. She worked the dressing with the specific economy she'd learned in the field, where you didn't have good light or clean surfaces and you worked with what you had. The wound had reopened at the inferior margin, which wasn't ideal but wasn't catastrophic. She packed it and applied pressure and told him so. 6 minutes, he said while she worked. Was that accurate? Approximately. The automatic protocol triggers a call, not a direct response. Actual arrival is probably 12 to 15. She secured the dressing. Can you walk upstairs? I've been walking on worse. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. Yes, he said. I can walk upstairs. They took the south stairwell. 3 flights up felt longer than it had going down, partly because they were moving slower and partly because the specific quality of aftermath, the adrenaline leaving, the body beginning to tabulate what it had cost, made distance feel different. She was aware of the pain in her shoulder from the pipe in the mechanical room. She was aware of the scrape on her left forearm from the duct. She was aware of Vane's breathing beside her, which was controlled but working harder than it should have been for 3 flights of stairs, which meant the shoulder was taking more from him than he was showing. They came out on the 3rd floor into the emergency lighting and the specific organized chaos of a ward that had experienced a power event and was managing the aftermath. Betta Okafor was at the nurse's station with a radio and the expression of someone who had been doing crisis management for 20 minutes and was very good at it and very tired. She saw Nora. Then she saw Vane. Then she looked at Nora's shoulder and Vane's face and the general condition of both of them, and whatever she'd been about to say went through several revisions before it came out as, "Tell me what you need." "Room," Nora said. "Crash cart nearby. His shoulder dressing needs replacement and proper irrigation. And when the security team arrives, and they will in about 8 minutes, I need you to tell them that Colonel Vane and I were on the 3rd floor during the power event, and that the disturbance on sublevel 2 should be treated as a potential unauthorized access incident." Bet held her look for a moment. In 20 years of hospital administration, she had developed an excellent capacity for identifying which questions were worth asking right now, and which ones were better filed for later. She filed this entire conversation for later. "Room 311's available," she said. Morrison restocked it. "That works," Nora said. They got Vane into 311. She got the overhead light on. The main power was back, which meant someone in facilities had found and addressed the cut. And she got him on the bed and got the compromised dressing off and looked at the wound properly under decent light for the first time. It was worse than the field assessment suggested, which was usually the case. The inferior reopening was clean, but deeper than she'd been able to tell in the dark, and the infection margin she'd been monitoring for the last day had responded to the disruption of the last hour with the specific opportunistic enthusiasm of a bacterial process that had been waiting for exactly this kind of physiological stress event. His temperature, when she checked it, she had a thermometer in her bag, another old habit, was 38.4, up from 37.8 at the last documented reading. "The infection is pushing back," she said. "I need to get the attending." "After," he said. "This isn't negotiable." 30 seconds, he said. "Look at me for 30 seconds and then get the attending." She looked at him. His face was pale, and the contusion above his eye had developed into something that was going to be dramatic by morning. His lip had stopped bleeding. He had the specific quality of a man who was accustomed to being in pain and had made a practical peace with the current amount of it. "Emily Carver," he said, not as an accusation. More like a person saying a name they'd been looking for in the dark for a long time and finally finding where it lived. She didn't correct him. She didn't confirm it either. There was a version of this conversation that she was ready for, and a version that she wasn't, and the one where she figured out what she was going to do about her own name after tonight. That one was going to take longer than 30 seconds. "You said you heard Price's voice directly," he said, "on the night of Harkin." "Yes? That's enough for a testimony hearing." "I know. Will you testify?" She looked at him for a moment. 11 years of knowing the answer to that question and not having the circumstances that made it possible. 11 years of a life built specifically to avoid the moment where that question could be asked. Yes, she said. And then, because she was not a person who made statements she hadn't thought through, I'll testify. Something in his face shifted. It wasn't relief exactly. Too complicated for that. More like a structure that had been weight-bearing for a very long time, receiving the news that it was about to be allowed to put the weight down. Get the attending, he said. She got the attending. Dr. Garrett arrived in room 311 at 6:42 a.m., looking like a man who had been called in early on a difficult morning and had decided that professionalism was the appropriate response to whatever was happening, details to be determined later. He looked at the wound, looked at the temperature reading Nora handed him, ordered an IV antibiotic push and a culture swab, and managed to do all of this without asking a single question about why his patient and the nurse he'd removed from this patient's case were both present and visibly damaged. It was, she thought, the most professionally competent she'd ever seen Garrett be. The security team arrived at 6:51, 2 from the hospital's own team and 1 officer from Salt Lake City PD who had the slightly bewildered quality of someone who had responded to an automatic alert and was still assembling the picture. She spoke to them in the hallway with the specific calm of someone who had done nothing requiring explanation and was simply providing contextual information. She told them she'd been in the building early to catch up on documentation. She told them she'd heard a disturbance on sub-level 2 and had moved the colonel from his room as a precaution given the power situation. She told them the men who had entered the building through the east entrance would be findable on the parking structure cameras, and she gave them the make of both vehicles as a starting point. She did not tell them about the duct, or the transmission, or Harlan Tuck, or Aldous Price. Those were conversations that belonged in a different room with different people. The officer took notes with the diligent patience of someone who understood that the full picture was not available to him yet and was collecting what he could in the meantime. The hospital security team took her incident statement on a form. She signed it. She went back to the nurse's station. She sat down. She was aware, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be for the last 2 hours, that her hands were not entirely steady. Not shaking. She didn't shake. She'd trained that out of herself a long time ago. But not the baseline stillness she maintained. She put them flat on the desk and breathed in and breathed out and let the ward do what it did around her. At 7:15, the day shift started arriving. Nora had been on shift for, she calculated, approaching 14 hours, if you counted from the beginning of last night's shift, or 90 minutes if you counted from when she'd technically arrived this morning. She didn't think the math resolved to anything clean. She was updating Dion Marsh's chart when her phone, the regular one, received a message. It was from a number she didn't recognize, which meant she recognized it. The number changed, but the format didn't. She read the message once. 61 is enough. Chain is moving. Price knows. 36 hours, maybe less. She put the phone face down on the desk. She finished Marsh's chart. She added the psych consult note for the second time, with slightly different language in case the first one hadn't been clear enough. At 8 o'clock, she went back to Marsh's room. He was awake, more awake than yesterday, which was something. Sitting up with the tray of food mostly eaten, the television still muted. He looked at her when she came in and then looked at her more carefully, the way young soldiers looked at people they were trying to read. "You look like you had a rough night," he said. "Long morning," she said. She checked his vitals. The blood pressure was better. The headache, when she asked, was a 2, which she believed this time. "Someone said there was a thing in the basement," he said. "Power went out. Maintenance issue. It's been handled." He was quiet for a moment. "The nurse last night, the overnight one, she said you'd been here since before 6. I had documentation to catch up on." He looked at her with the specific skepticism of someone who had learned not to accept easy explanations and was young enough that he hadn't learned yet to pretend he had. "Okay," he said. She wrote down his blood pressure numbers. She looked at the psych consult field in his chart and added a note that the attending should treat this as a priority recommendation, not a suggested follow-up. "The consult I recommended," she said. "Someone's going to come talk to you today. I want you to actually talk to them." He looked at the ceiling. "I'm fine." "I know you think that." "You don't know what I think." "No," she said. but I know what that looks like. She put the chart down and looked at him directly. It gets easier to carry when you let someone else hold part of it. That's all I know about it. He looked at her. He looked at her shoulder, at the scrape on her forearm, at whatever her face was doing that she wasn't entirely controlling. You carrying something? He said. She picked the chart back up. Everyone in this building is carrying something, she said. That's what a veterans hospital is. She left him with the muted television. Boykin. The call came at 10:47, not to her phone, to the hospital. The main line redirected to the nursing director's office, and then to Bet Okafor, and then to Nora, in that order, each handoff happening with a speed that said someone on the other end of the line had enough institutional weight to move things quickly. She took the call in the break room with the door closed and the flickering fluorescent above the door counting out its irregular rhythm. Captain Carver. The voice was a woman's, measured with the specific cadence of someone who had spent time in both formal institutional settings and situations where formal language was insufficient. My name is Adrienne Sorrell. I'm with the Defense Intelligence Review Office. I believe you know what that is. Yes, Nora said. I need to inform you that as of 40 minutes ago, we initiated a formal investigation under federal statute into the conduct of Deputy Director Aldous Price and associated parties relating to operations conducted in 2009 and 2010. A pause. The authorization signatures you transmitted this morning were the trigger document we needed to move this from a pending inquiry to an active investigation. Nora sat with that for a moment. The fluorescent above the door flickered. The 61% was enough, she said. Combined with what we already had, yes. Another pause. I also need to inform you that Price was notified of the investigation by legal protocol 40 minutes ago, as required under the statute. His legal team has already filed a motion to suppress. That motion will fail, but it will take 6 to 8 weeks to fail. What happens in the meantime? In the meantime, he's restricted from operational functions but remains technically in his position pending the proceeding. Sorrell's voice was measured. I want to be honest with you about what this process looks like. It's not fast, it's not clean. There will be filings and counterfilings, and his legal team is very good, and the next several months will likely be... I know what federal investigations look like, Nora said. I've been waiting for one for 11 years. A pause. We'd like to arrange a formal witness interview within the next 72 hours. Your testimony regarding the operational communications on the night of Harkin is, frankly, it's the piece we've been missing. The documentary evidence establishes the mechanism. Your testimony establishes the intent. I'll testify, Nora said. I already told someone else that this morning. Colonel Vane? Yes. He called us, Sorrell said, at 6:15 this morning, before you transmitted anything. He'd been trying to reach this office for 3 days since before he was admitted to Harlow. She paused. He'd figured out most of it on his own. He just didn't have the name. Nora sat with that too. Vane had been moving before she'd ever gone into his room at 5:40. Before the drive, before the duct, before Tuck and the server room, and all of it. He'd been pulling the thread from his end before she'd decided to pull it from hers, and they'd been moving toward the same point from opposite directions, and she hadn't known because she'd spent 11 years assuming she was doing this alone. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She noted the feeling and set it aside. I'll be available for the interview, she said. I'll need to arrange coverage for my shift. There was a brief silence, as if the woman on the other end was recalibrating slightly. Of course, Sorrell said. She ended the call. She sat in the break room with the bad coffee smell and the flickering light for 3 minutes. Then she went back to the ward. At noon, a federal vehicle arrived at Harlow Veterans Medical Center. Not black, not unmarked in the obvious way. A standard government fleet sedan, gray, with the specific understated bureaucratic presence of an institution that wanted to be visible but not theatrical. Nora was at the nurse's station when Bet came to tell her. 2 people asking for Colonel Vane, Bet said. Credentials from a federal review office. Let them up, Nora said. Betty held her look for a moment. You want to tell me something? Later, Nora said. There'll be time. Bet left. Nora watched the elevator doors open and two people come out, a man and a woman, both in civilian clothes, both with the specific upright bearing of people who were serious about what they did without being theatrical about it. They spoke to her briefly, introduced themselves, showed credentials from the Defense Intelligence Review Office, and asked where they could find the colonel. She walked them to room 311 herself. Vane was sitting up in bed with the IV antibiotic drip running and the beginnings of what was going to be an impressive bruise above his right eye. He looked at the two people who came in. He looked at Nora. "Dairo," she said. "Adrienne Sorel's team." Something passed over his face. It wasn't quite relief. It was more specific than that. The particular expression of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for a specific duration and has just been told he can set it down but hasn't yet physically done it, and is in the moment between knowing he can and doing it. She left them to it. She went back to the nurse's station. She sat down. She pulled up a chart, Dion Marsh's again, and she was staring at it without reading it when Morrison appeared beside her. "The psych consult for Marsh," Morrison said. "Dr. Ibarra says it's scheduled for 2 o'clock. "Good," Nora said. Morrison looked at her for a second. "You okay? You've been here since—" "I'm fine," Nora said. Morrison left. Nora was not fine in the ordinary sense of the word, but she was functional and present, and the ward had needs, and she was here, which was what fine meant on a hospital floor after a long shift. She'd learned that definition a while ago. At 1:15, her prepaid phone vibrated in her jacket pocket. One message. From the unlabeled number. "Tuck is talking. Price's suppression motion was rejected on emergency review. It went to a judge who served in the Army and had personal knowledge of Harkin-era operations. The motion is dead." She read it twice. She put the phone back in her pocket. The suppression motion was dead. Whatever Price's legal team had filed to stop the investigation before it reached a proceeding, it had hit a wall and the wall had held, which meant the authorization signatures were in evidence, which meant the investigation was moving, which meant 36 hours had just become considerably less. She went to check on Dion Marsh. He was asleep. She stood in his doorway for a moment looking at him. 22 years old, fractured wrist on a pillow, the specific stillness of someone finally getting the rest they'd been running from. And she thought about the psych consult at 2 o'clock, and the note she'd written twice, and whether he'd actually talk to someone when they came. She thought there was a reasonable chance he would. She went back to work. At 3 in the afternoon, Bet Okafor came to find her again, and this time her face had a quality Nora hadn't seen on it before. Not crisis management Bet, not administrative authority Bet, but something that belonged to a person underneath the roles. "Conference room 2, Bet said. "There's a call holding for you, line 3. "Who is it?" Bet looked at her. "Man who said his name is Aldous Price." The hallway was very ordinary around her. Monitors, linoleum, the distant sound of a patient call button, all of it the same as it had been 5 minutes ago and 5 hours ago and every day for 3 years. "Did he say what it concerns?" Nora said. "He said you'd know." She walked to conference room 2. She closed the door behind her. She looked at the phone on the table with line 3 blinking. She sat down. She had not spoken to Aldous Price since the night of Operation Harkin. She had not spoken to him then, actually. She had heard his voice on an open communications channel, giving an order, in real time, in a situation where she understood exactly what the order meant and could not stop it. She had spent 11 years carrying that voice in her memory with the specific, careful maintenance of someone preserving a piece of evidence that had no other container. She picked up the phone. "This is Nora Ellison," she said. A pause. Then a voice she recognized with the precision of something heard once under extreme conditions and retained perfectly, measured, institutional, carrying the particular authority of a man who had spent a long career being the kind of person other people were careful around. "Captain Carver," Price said. "I think it's time we spoke directly." She looked at the wall of conference room 2. She thought about the 61% sitting on a server she didn't control, and Tuck's decision to walk out of the server room, and Sorrell's voice saying the motion is dead, and Vane in room 311 with the DIRO team. She thought about the things she hadn't told anyone. the second piece of information, the one that wasn't in any document or transmission or cloud partition. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." "You've been very patient," he said. 11 years is a long time to wait." "It is," she said. "I want to offer you something," he said. "A resolution, clean, fast, out of the federal system, without the years of procedure that an investigation—" "Deputy Director," she said, and her voice was very level. "I'm going to stop you there because I want to tell you something before you finish that sentence." She paused. "There are 4 surviving soldiers from Operation Harkin. One of them is upstairs in this hospital right now, speaking to federal investigators. The other 3 have been located by the same investigators and contacted in the last 6 hours. All 4 of them have been waiting for this for 11 years. Silence. "Whatever you are going to offer me," she said, "it doesn't resolve what you owe them." Another silence, longer this time. When Price spoke again, the specific institutional authority in his voice had changed quality. Not gone. He was too experienced for it to go. But something underneath it had shifted, like a structure taking on weight it hadn't been designed for. "You understand this process will take years," he said. "Yes? And in the meantime, I'll be here," she said. "I've been here for 3 years. I'm good at it." She heard him breathe. She heard, in that breath, the particular sound of a man who had spent a long career being the person who made calls like this one and was encountering, for what might have been the first time, the experience of making a call that went differently than planned. "There's something you haven't told them," he said, in the transmission. "There's something you've kept back." She looked at the wall. There it was. He knew. He knew there was something she was holding because he was Aldous Price and he'd been managing secrets for 30 years, and he could calculate what was in a transmission and what was missing from it. "If you're holding something back," he said, "then we still have something to discuss." She considered that for exactly 2 seconds. "I held it back," she said, "because I wanted to tell it to a federal grand jury in person, not upload it. That's the difference between a document and testimony. You've had 3 days to suppress the documents. You can't suppress me." She could hear him processing that. She could hear, in the quality of his silence, the specific sound of a 30-year career encountering the thing that ends it. "The grand jury," he said. "The grand jury," she confirmed. "My interview with DIRO is in 72 hours. The grand jury referral, based on what I understand of the timeline, is approximately 6 weeks after that." She paused. "You have good lawyers. I'm sure they've already told you what surviving a grand jury with direct witness testimony looks like." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She waited in it. She was good at waiting. She'd had practice. When Price spoke again, his voice had something in it that she hadn't heard there before and would not have expected to hear, which was the specific flatness of a man who has just understood something he cannot change. "You've been planning this," he said. "No," she said, honestly. "I've been a nurse for 3 years in this hospital with these patients." She looked at the door of conference room 2, through which, somewhere down the hallway, a 22-year-old soldier with a fractured wrist was talking to a psychologist for the first time. "The planning part happened without me." She ended the call. She sat in conference room 2 for 4 minutes. The room was bland. A table, chairs, a whiteboard with old marker on it that someone had half erased. The fluorescent above her didn't flicker, which was a minor point in its favor. Then she picked up the phone again and called Bet. "I need to request personal leave starting tomorrow," she said. 3 days. I have federal commitments I need to attend to." "I'll file it," Bet said. And then, "Nora, are you going to tell me what's been happening?" Nora thought about it. "Later," she said. "There's going to be a point where it's all in the public record. When it is, I'll tell you the parts that aren't." She hung up. She sat for a moment longer in the quiet room, and then her regular phone rang, not a number she recognized, which meant she recognized the format. She answered. "Captain Carver?" A man's voice. Younger than Sorrel, harder around the edges. "This is Investigator Paulson, DIRO Field Office. I'm downstairs in the lobby. I need to ask you to not leave the building." She went very still. "Why?" she said. "Because in the last 20 minutes we've lost contact with 2 of the 4 surviving Harkin soldiers. The third has been moved to protective custody. Colonel Vane is being transferred to a secure medical facility within the hour. A pause that had something careful in it. And Aldous Price left his residence 11 minutes ago. His legal team filed an emergency injunction at 2:58 to stop the DIRO investigation on national security grounds. The judge who rejected the suppression motion recused herself. The injunction is currently before a second judge whose ruling history we're assessing. She looked at the wall. The injunction was alive. Price had moved the moment she'd hung up. Or before she'd hung up, she realized, because a man like Price had contingencies for contingencies, and the phone call had not been an attempt to negotiate. It had been an attempt to locate her, to confirm that she was in the building, stationary and reachable. She was still in the building. She was stationary. The question of reachable was the one that mattered now. "How many people do you have downstairs?" she said. A pause that told her the answer before he said it. Two. Against an operation that had moved 4 vehicles into a federal medical facility that morning and had the kind of legal infrastructure that could file an emergency injunction within 12 minutes of a phone call ending. She looked at the conference room door. She thought about Vane being transferred, the DIRO team in room 311, the injunction before a second judge, Price in a vehicle somewhere in Salt Lake City, moving. She thought about the second piece of information, the one that wasn't in any document, the one she'd told Price she was saving for the grand jury. She thought about what happens when the only thing standing between an investigation and its collapse is a single witness who can be reached. She stood up. "Paulson," she said, "do you have a secure recording device with you?" Yes." "Come up to the 3rd floor," she said. "Conference room 2. Bring it." "Captain, our protocol requires—" "Aldous Price is moving," she said. "I don't know where he's going, but I know what he needs to stop, and I am the thing he needs to stop. So either you come upstairs with your recorder in the next 4 minutes, or I say what I know into my own phone and email it to every investigative journalist contact I have, and then we find out whether that holds up better than sworn testimony." A pause. 4 minutes, Paulson said. She put the phone down. She looked at the whiteboard with its half-erased marker and its optimistic blankness. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the 4 soldiers from Operation Harkin, 3 of them somewhere she didn't know, and 1 being loaded into a transfer vehicle 1 floor above her head. She thought about the voice on the communications channel, giving an order in real time, while her rescue team was still 300 meters out. She thought about what she had been carrying for 11 years, and what it was worth, and who it was for. The door to conference room 2 opened. Paulson was a young man, younger than she'd expected, with a serious face and a recorder in his hand. Behind him was his partner, a woman, mid-30s, with the kind of stillness that Nora recognized as professional and hard-earned. She looked at both of them. "Sit down," she said. They sat. She looked at the recorder. "My name," she said, and her voice was very steady, "is Emily Carver. I hold the rank of Captain, Army Special Operations, serial number classified pending restoration of active status. On the night of September 14th, 2009, I was the primary medic attached to the Sierra Kilo rescue element assigned to Operation Harkin. At 22:17 local time, I was on an open communication channel with the Operational Coordination Relay when I heard a voice I subsequently identified as Deputy Director Aldous Price give the following order. She stopped. In the hallway outside the conference room, the sound of the ward continued, monitors and wheels and the distant human noise of a building full of people being carefully kept alive. And then, somewhere below, the fire alarm went off. Paulson was already on his radio before the second alarm pulse finished. Emily didn't move from her chair. She looked at the recorder on the table, still running, the small red light steady, and she made a decision in the space of approximately 2 seconds that was informed by 11 years of specific experience with the way people use institutional chaos as cover for operational objectives. "It's not a fire," she said. Paulson looked at her. "It's a pull station," she said. "Manual activation. Someone in the building pulled it to create an evacuation that moves patients and staff into the corridors and stairwells where they're harder to track and easier to intercept. She looked at the recorder. I need 2 more minutes. Captain, the protocol? Paulson. She said his name with the specific weight of someone who needed him to understand something quickly. Price left his residence 11 minutes before you called me. This building is 12 minutes from his last known location. The alarm went off 3 minutes after you told me he was moving. Do the math. He did the math. She watched him do it. 2 minutes, he said. She looked at the recorder. At 22:17 local time on September 14th, 2009, she said, and her voice was level and precise and carried the specific quality of something that had been stored carefully for a very long time and was finally being placed somewhere outside herself. I heard Deputy Director Aldous Price, speaking on the operational coordination channel designated Harkin Primary, give the following direct order to the communications relay officer on duty: abort the Sierra Kilo extraction, reclassify the package as hostile, and authorize terminal resolution of all forward assets. She paused. Terminal resolution. That was the language he used. I was 30 meters from the position at the time. I heard it in real time through my tactical earpiece, and I continued the approach because I had soldiers alive at that position, and I was not going to stop. She looked at Paulson. The relay officer's name was Staff Sergeant Dwight Farrow. He was 26 years old. He refused the order. He told Price the rescue element was already in the wire. Price repeated the order. Farrow went silent. I don't know what happened to Farrow after that night. I've never been able to find out. Paulson was very still. That's the testimony, she said. Price gave a direct order to abandon and classify a U.S. rescue team as hostile combatants while they were actively pulling wounded soldiers out of a kill zone. That's not a policy failure or a strategic miscalculation. That's a crime with a name. She reached over and stopped the recorder. Now, let's go, Tim. The hallway was controlled chaos, the specific organized disorder of a ward executing evacuation protocol, staff moving patients, call bells going unanswered because everyone was in motion. Emily moved through it quickly, Paulson and his partner flanking her without being asked, which told her they'd recalibrated and were doing their jobs. The stairwell was crowded with the evacuation flow. She went against it, pressing to the wall, moving up rather than down, because Vane's transfer was being coordinated from the 3rd floor, and if Price's operation was using the evacuation as cover for an intercept, the transfer vehicle was the target. She came out on 3 into the opposite flow of the same controlled disorder. Room 311 was empty. The IV stand was still there. The bed still carried the impression of recent occupation. She was already turning for the elevator when Bet Okafor appeared from the nurse's station with the expression of someone who had made a decision about which side of a situation she was on. They took him out the north exit, Bet said. 2 DIRO agents and a medical transport team. They left 4 minutes ago. Which vehicle? White van, medical markings. I wrote down the plate. She held out a sticky note. Emily took it. She handed it to Paulson without looking at it. Can you confirm that transport? He was already on his radio. He moved down the hall to get clear air on the channel. Bet looked at Emily with the 20-year look. Tell me one thing, she said. Is he going to be all right? Emily thought about Vane, the shoulder, the infection trending down, the bruise above his eye, the specific quality of a man who had been carrying something for 11 years and had just started putting it down. Yes, she said. He's going to be all right. Bet nodded once, the way people nod when they've decided to believe something and are committing to it. She went back to managing her ward. Paulson came back. Transport is confirmed and tracked. It's clean. The DIRO team is secure. Colonel Vane is in transit to a federal medical facility in Ogden. And Price? A pause that told her the answer before he gave it. His vehicle was stopped at the Harlow security perimeter 11 minutes ago. Hospital security held him on a facility access issue while we were... He stopped. He's in custody. Federal agents from the Salt Lake field office arrived 7 minutes ago. The hallway continued its evacuation noise around her. Somewhere a door was banging open and closed in the wind from an exit. She looked at Paulson. She looked at his partner. She looked at the recorder in his hand. That's enough for today, she said. The fire department cleared the building at 4:18 p.m. The pull station had been activated on sublevel 1 near the mechanical room, which told her exactly who had activated it and confirmed that the person who'd done it was connected to Price's operation and had known the building's layout in advance. That detail would matter later in a proceeding. For now, it was just a data point she filed and set down. She went back to work. Not because there was nothing else to do. There was, in fact, an enormous amount else to do, a category of things that had their own weight and timeline, and would occupy the next several months of her life in ways she hadn't fully mapped yet. She went back to work because the ward had patients, and the evacuation had disrupted medication schedules, and Dion Marsh had missed his 2 o'clock psych consult, and she needed to reschedule it. She rescheduled it for 4:45. Dr. Ibarra, to his credit, came back without complaint. She was at the nurse's station documenting when Marsh's door opened at 5:50, and he came out. Not discharged, he was still in the hospital gown, still moving carefully around the fractured wrist, just standing in the doorway of his room with the specific look of someone who had just done something harder than expected and was assessing how they felt about it. He looked down the hall and found her. She waited. He walked to the station. He stood there for a moment. "That was rough," he said. "Yeah," she said. "She wants me to come back tomorrow." "That's a good sign." He looked at his wrist in its brace. He looked at the ward around him, the ordinary, ongoing life of it, the monitors and the wheels and the people moving through their specific private difficulties. She said something about... He stopped. About how the problem isn't feeling things. The problem is when feeling things stops feeling like something you're allowed to do. Emily looked at him. "She said that?" she said. "Yeah." He seemed slightly surprised that he was repeating it. Is that a thing?" "Yes," Emily said. "That's a thing." He stood there for a moment longer, then he went back to his room. She watched him go, and she thought about the note she'd written twice, and she thought about the gap between a note that nobody reads and a door that opens at 5:50. She went back to the documentation. The next 72 hours were the specific, unglamorous work of a machinery that had been waiting to move and was now moving. Emily's formal DIRO interview took 4 hours and covered things she had not said out loud in 11 years, and saying them out loud had a physical quality she hadn't anticipated. Not cathartic exactly, more like the sensation of setting down something heavy that had been reshaping the muscles around it for so long that the absence of the weight felt like a kind of recalibration. The interview was recorded in full. Her testimony about Price's order on the Harkin channel was submitted as a sworn statement to the federal investigation. Paulson's recording from Conference Room 2 became the first piece of evidence formally entered into the investigative record. Aldous Price was formally placed under federal investigation on a Wednesday morning. The charges filed were conspiracy, criminal negligence causing death, obstruction of military operations, and conduct endangering U.S. service members. His legal team contested every charge. That was expected. What was less expected, what his lawyers had apparently not adequately prepared for, was that Harlan Tuck, presented with the full scope of what the investigation had assembled, made a decision about self-preservation that involved being considerably more cooperative than his employer would have preferred. Tuck's cooperation produced 3 additional witnesses and a second set of financial documentation that the original transmission hadn't contained. The second set of documents included payment records. Specific, dated, detailed payment records connecting Price to the defense contractors who had facilitated the illegal weapons transfer that Operation Harkin had been arranged to conceal. The contractors were identified as Meridian Defense Solutions and a shell company registered in Delaware under the name Arsalan Group. Both entities' leadership was named in the federal filing. The filing was a matter of public record. It became, within 48 hours, the kind of public record that newspapers and investigative journalists referenced extensively. Price's name was in print on a Thursday. By Friday morning, it was being read aloud on news broadcasts. His legal team issued a statement. The statement was the kind that legal teams issue when the documentation is too specific to dispute and the strategy is shifted from defense to mitigation. It said very little while using a significant number of words. Price did not address the press himself. Emily heard about this on the radio in her car, driving to her 3rd DIRO meeting, and she turned the volume up and listened to it for 30 seconds and then turned it back down to a normal level and drove the rest of the way in the specific quiet of a person who has received a piece of information they've been waiting for long enough that the arrival of it is more steady than triumphant. The question of Emily Carver's official status was resolved in a series of steps that took several weeks, and that she was present for only some of, which was appropriate because her presence was required for the parts that required a person and not for the parts that required paperwork. And there was a great deal of paperwork. Her record was amended by formal order of the Army Personnel Command. The KIA designation entered in 2009 was rescinded. Her service record was restored, including the combat awards that had been filed and then buried in the same administrative action that had erased her. The restoration was documented in a letter that used the word regret twice, which was not the language she would have chosen, but which was, she understood, the language available to institutions doing something they didn't have a precedent template for. Colonel Marcus Vane wrote a separate statement. It was not institutional language. He wrote it himself. She could tell from the construction of it, the same controlled and precise handwriting she'd seen on the notepad paper in room 311. The statement described, in specific operational detail, what had happened on the night of September 14, 2009, and what he had witnessed and been unable to explain for 11 years, and what he now knew and was formally attesting to. The statement was submitted to the investigation, included in the public record, and read into the congressional briefing that the investigation eventually triggered. The congressional briefing happened 6 weeks after the investigation opened. Emily was not present for it. She was on the 3rd floor of Harlow Veterans Medical Center, working a 12-hour shift, and she read a summary of it in a news article on her break. The summary covered Price's appearance before the committee, which had not gone well for Price. It covered the testimony of 2 of the 3 surviving Harkin soldiers who had been found and contacted by the DIRO team. It covered the committee chair's statement about accountability and institutional failure and the obligations owed to service members by the people who had authority over their lives. The article was careful and thorough and written by someone who had done their homework, and she read it in the break room with the bad coffee smell and the flickering fluorescent. And she thought it was probably the most important thing she'd read in 11 years. And she finished her coffee and went back to work. 3 months after the investigation opened, Aldous Price was indicted on 7 federal counts. The indictment was unsealed on a Tuesday. The specific counts included conspiracy to commit murder of federal agents and service members, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts related to the weapons transfer. The indictment named Price specifically as the individual who had given the terminal resolution order and who had arranged the subsequent cover-up through deliberate falsification of operational records. It named Meridian Defense Solutions and Arsaline Group as co-conspirators. It named 4 additional individuals from the defense contractor network. His legal team announced their intention to fight every count. The announcement was noted and filed. Emily heard about the indictment from Paulson, who called her at 7:15 in the morning while she was getting ready for a shift. He read her the primary count language. She thanked him. She finished getting ready. She drove to work. She was at the nurse's station at 7:55 when Bet Okafor appeared beside her and set down a cup of coffee. Good coffee, not the break room kind, the kind from the place 2 blocks from the hospital that Bet occasionally brought in when something warranted it. "I heard," Bet said. "Yeah," Emily said. "You gonna be okay today?" Emily picked up the coffee. She thought about what okay meant on a hospital floor, the definition she'd settled on a long time ago. "I'll be here," she said. Bet nodded. She went back to her work. Spring came to Salt Lake City in the way it came, reluctantly and then all at once. A week of cold followed by a week of light that made the buildings look like they'd been cleaned. The mountains above the city still held snow at their tops, which the light hit in the morning and turned a color that had no useful name. Emily noticed it on the drive in. She'd started noticing things like that, which was something she was aware of without quite knowing what to do with it. 3 years of being careful and contained, and she hadn't stopped being those things. But there was a quality of attention coming back online that she hadn't realized she'd been managing down. She changed in the locker room. She tied her hair back with the clip that had seen better days, which she kept replacing and then not replacing because it worked fine. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. 34 years old, a scar on the inside of her left forearm, a new small one on her shoulder from the pipe in the mechanical room that she expected would fade. She looked like the person she'd been looking at in mirrors for 3 years. And she also, she thought, looked slightly different in the way that people look slightly different when something they've been holding at a specific tension is no longer at that tension. She went upstairs. The morning was the ordinary kind. Medication schedules, a new admission, a family meeting about a post-surgical patient's discharge plan. She was in the middle of updating a chart at 9:15 when she heard the elevator. She heard the elevator because she always heard it. 3 years of knowing which sound meant which kind of arrival. And this one had a particular quality that she'd learned to read. She looked up. Marcus Vane came out of the elevator on a Thursday morning in April wearing civilian clothes and walking without the specific careful management of someone protecting an injury. The shoulder had healed. It had taken longer than it should have because of the infection and the events of February, and his attending at the Ogden facility had apparently been direct with him about his cooperation with the recovery process being suboptimal in the early weeks. But he had, eventually, cooperated with it. He walked to the nurse's station. He stood in front of it the way he stood everywhere, which was upright and without waste. She looked at him. The bruise was gone. The cut on his lip had healed clean. He looked like a man who had put down something heavy and was in the early stages of learning what his posture felt like without it. "Colonel?" she said. "Captain," he said, which was the first time he'd used that word directly to her, and it landed differently than she'd expected, not because of the rank, but because of the directness of it, the specific quality of being seen accurately by someone who had worked to understand what they were seeing. "You look better," she said. "You look exactly the same," he said, which was not quite true but was his way of saying something else, which was that he had expected her to look different, and she didn't, and he was working out what that meant. "I'm good at my job," she said. "I know." He put a hand on the edge of the station counter. "I wanted to tell you, the congressional referral for the full Harkin record declassification passed committee. It goes to a floor vote in 3 weeks. I heard. If it passes, the surviving soldiers get full official recognition, mission commendations, the whole thing, properly documented." He paused, "including the rescue element." She looked at him. She thought about the 2 people who had come in with her on that September night and had not come out. She thought about them the way she had thought about them for 11 years, which was not constantly, but never not. The way you carry something that has become part of the weight you're used to and would feel strange without. "That matters," she said. "It does," he said. They stood in the particular quiet of the nurse's station with the ward happening around them, the monitors, the wheels, the sound of a morning shift in full function. "Are you staying?" he said. "Here, I mean, at Harlow." She'd been asked this in different forms by different people over the past 3 months. By Paulson, who had asked it practically. By Sorrell, who had asked it with the specific institutional interest of someone who was aware of her skills and their potential applications. By Bet, who had asked it in the way Bet asked things, which was direct and without a particular agenda. She'd given different versions of the same answer to all of them. "Yes," she said, "I'm staying." Vane looked at her steadily. "Because it's easier? Or because it's right?" "Because the people in these rooms need someone who pays attention," she said. "And I pay attention, and that's enough of a reason." He held her look for a moment. He seemed to be deciding something. "I have a referral," he said. "A soldier, 29 years old, medically discharged after a 3rd deployment TB1 adjustment disorder. He's been through 2 facilities that weren't the right fit." He paused. "I told him I knew somewhere that paid attention." She reached under the counter and got him an intake form. He took it. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. It came out carrying more weight than the words themselves, the way some statements do when they're standing in for something longer that both parties understand. "Don't thank me," she said. "Fill out the form." He almost smiled. He took the form and went to sit in the waiting area. She watched him go, and she went back to the chart she'd been updating. The vote passed 4 weeks later, 17-4, with 2 abstentions. The Harkin record was formally declassified, and the surviving soldiers, 3 of the original 4, the 4th having died of unrelated causes in 2019, were recognized in a formal army ceremony that Emily did not attend because she was working and had made her peace with the fact that ceremonies were not the part of this that had ever mattered to her. What had mattered was the thing she'd been told in a parking garage in Tucson 11 years ago by a woman whose name she'd been asked not to record and had kept in her memory the same way she'd kept Price's voice, that the difference between evidence and justice was the person willing to carry one until the other became possible. She had carried it. The other had become possible. The gap between those two things was 11 years and a specific set of choices that she did not regret and did not celebrate because they were just what had been necessary, and that was the honest accounting of it. Price's trial was scheduled for the following fall. His legal team had filed 12 motions in 3 months. 11 had been denied. The 12th was pending. Emily had been informed that her testimony would be required in person, and she had informed them, in return, that she would be there. Harlan Tuck pleaded to a reduced charge in exchange for his cooperation and received a sentence that the newspapers called lenient and that Emily assessed as pragmatically appropriate because Tuck was not the architect, he was the instrument, and the information he'd provided had substantially accelerated the architecture of the case against the man who was. Meridian Defense Solutions ceased operations in March. Its assets were seized pending the federal investigation. Arcelene Group was dissolved by court order. The combined financial exposure of the contractor network exceeded the kind of number that had commas in 2 places. None of this was clean. None of it was fast. None of it resolved into a shape that had clear edges and satisfying proportions, because that was not what justice looked like when it arrived through the machinery of federal procedure. What it looked like was paperwork and hearings and a great deal of waiting. And the thing at the center of it that made the waiting bearable was not triumph, but the specific modest weight of something being true in a place where it had been false. On the last day of April, Emily found a note in Dion Marsh's chart. He'd been discharged 3 weeks after his admission, the wrist healing, the concussion resolving, the psych consult having been extended to 4 sessions, and then a referral to an outpatient program that he had, according to the follow-up documentation, actually attended. The note in his chart was from his outpatient therapist, a brief progress summary filed as part of the VA coordination protocol. The summary said, "Patient demonstrates increased engagement with treatment. Reports feeling, in his words, like someone finally told him he was allowed to put it down." She read that twice. She thought about the 20-year-old version of herself who had made a decision in a parking garage in Tucson, and the 34-year-old version of herself standing in a hospital hallway in April, and the distance between them measured not in years, but in the specific accumulation of things carried and things set down and things understood too late, and things understood exactly when they needed to be. She thought about the soldiers in this building, and the ones she'd carried out of a kill zone on a September night in 2009, and the ones she hadn't been able to carry, and the one who had left a note in a hospital chart that said, "allowed to put it down." And she thought about what it cost people to keep carrying things that were never supposed to be permanent, and what it cost the people around them to watch them do it, and what it meant when someone finally said out loud that the weight was real, and the carrying was real, and the putting it down was also real and available and permitted. She closed the chart. She went to check on her next patient, a 61-year-old veteran named Harold Osei, who had been admitted for a knee replacement, and who, she had determined on day 2 of his admission, was hiding a secondary complaint behind the orthopedic one, the way people sometimes hid the thing that was actually wrong behind the thing that was officially wrong. She knocked and went in. He was sitting up with the television on and muted, which was apparently what veterans did in hospital rooms. He looked at her the way he looked at her every morning, which was with the slightly cautious patience of someone who had not yet decided how much they were going to say. "How's the knee?" she said. "The knee is fine," he said, which was true and also not the point. She checked the incision. She checked his vitals. She wrote things down. "You want to tell me about the other thing?" she said. He looked at the muted television. "What other thing?" "The one that's keeping you awake." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know something's keeping me awake?" "Because you're always awake when I come in, and you always look like you've been thinking for a while." "Mickey." He was quiet for a little longer. Then, still looking at the television, "My son is deploying in 6 weeks. 3rd time. I keep thinking about whether the people making decisions about where he goes are, whether they... He stopped. She looked at him. She thought about what she knew about the people making those decisions, and about what she'd spent the last 3 months doing to the ones who had made them wrong, and about the specific limits of what she could say to a father in a hospital bed. There are people watching, she said. People who are supposed to hold them accountable. They don't always do it fast enough. She paused. But they do it. He looked at her. He seemed to be deciding whether to believe that. You sound like you know something about it, he said. A little, she said. She finished the documentation. She put the chart down. She stood in the room for a moment longer than was strictly clinical. The other thing, she said, the thing keeping you awake. Tell Dr. Ibarra about it, or tell the chaplain, or tell me, or tell anyone. Just tell someone. He looked at her. Why does that matter? Because the only things that stay heavy forever, she said, are the ones nobody helps you carry. She left him with the muted television and the morning light coming in at the window. She went back to the hallway. She went back to the station. She went back to work. Not because the larger things were finished. They weren't. They wouldn't be for a long time. But because the ward was full and the morning was moving and there were people in these rooms who needed someone who paid attention, and she was here, and she was that person, and that was the truest and most durable thing she knew about herself. Not the rank, not the record being restored, not the testimony or the indictment or the declassified file or the name spoken correctly by a man who'd spent 11 years not knowing who had pulled him out of a kill zone. Just this: a hallway, a chart, a patient behind a door, and the decision to walk through it. That was the work. That was the choice. And it was hers, every morning, without condition.